Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive paradox in early American history. We're talking about a brand new nation founded on this soaring, beautiful rhetoric of liberty that, at the exact same time, was deeply entrenching systems of bondage and exclusion. So let's get into this contradiction and uncover how the United States actually navigated its founding ideals.
The ink was barely dry on the Constitution when the new country hit a wall. They had to grapple with one massive question. How exactly does a nation built on equality define freedom in the real world? And as we'll see, liberty was definitely not universal. It depended entirely on where you lived, how you worshipped, and who you were.
To unpack this whole paradox, we'll navigate 5 key themes today. 1. The regional divide. 2. Cotton fuels expansion. 3. Who gets to be free? 4. Uncoupling church and state. And finally, 5. The spiritual marketplace. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The regional divide and the contrasting paths of early states. Right out of the gate, the Constitution left the crucial issue of slavery largely unresolved, which set up a really delicate geographic balancing act.
You can see the federal government trying to juggle this balance of power between the North and South from day one. In 1787, the Northwest Ordinance explicitly banned slavery north and west of the Ohio River. Now, a lot of Americans thought this meant the founders intended for slavery to just naturally fade away. But a very different path quickly emerged. Vermont is admitted to the Union as a free state in 1791. But then, literally just 1 year later, Kentucky comes in as a slave state. The government was carefully, meticulously weighing the scales of regional power.
Section 2. Cotton fuels expansion, the economic engine of slavery. Let's look at the economic catalyst that completely rewired the Southern landscape.
To really grasp the scale here, just think about the demographics. By 1810, the enslaved population in the South had exploded to a staggering 1.1 million people. Just 20 years earlier, in 1790, that number was around 650,000. That is a massive, rapid jump. So, what triggered it?
Well, agriculture shifted drastically. During the colonial days, tobacco was the undisputed king, right? But it was absolutely brutal on the environment. It chewed through soil nutrients so fast that fields were basically reduced to useless grass patches after just 4 or 5 harvests. Then you have short staple cotton. This crop was entirely different. It could grow basically anywhere across the South. The only catch, it was incredibly tedious and difficult to harvest.
But that roadblock totally vanished with the invention of the cotton gin in 1794. The gin fundamentally changed the game, making it drastically easier to separate those tough seeds from the fiber. Pair that with steam power coming along a few decades later, and cotton became the ultimate engine pushing Southern westward expansion. The wild thing is, within just 10 years of the gin's invention, Southern production didn't just grow, it skyrocketed to this massive annual output, 60 million pounds a year. White Southerners literally raced westward, aggressively building a cotton-driven slave society as they swallowed up new territory.
Section 3. Who gets to be free? The limits of early democracy. Now, as the South expanded its slave economy at this dizzying rate, northern states were wrestling with their own shifting definitions of citizenship. Even in the North, legal barriers were piling up, systematically building what was essentially a white man's republic. And this is crucial because these laws set boundaries of exclusion that lasted for generations. Take the 1790 Naturalization Act. It strictly limited federal citizenship to free white people. Then Congress passes the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law, making it a federal crime to harbor a freedom-seeking enslaved person. That meant free black people in the North faced the constant, terrifying risk of being kidnapped and dragged south with zero political recourse. In New Jersey, they actually went backwards. In 1807, they altered their constitution to restrict voting strictly to white men, stripping away the voting rights that all propertied men had previously held.
And for states actually abolishing slavery, it wasn't some instant flip of a switch. It was this painfully slow process called gradual emancipation. The laws often forced freed children into long periods of indentured servitude just to compensate their enslaver. Take the story of James Mars. He was a young guy in Connecticut indentured under this exact system. He literally had to risk being thrown in jail just to protest a legal arrangement that bound him to his mother's enslaver until he turned 25. So yeah, freedom was deeply, deeply conditional.
Section 4. Uncoupling church and state. Let's shift gears from racial divides to another massive ideological battle of the era, religious liberty. We often think the separation of church and state was just this instant day one foundational truth of America. But back in 1776, Early America began with a heavy integration of the two. All 13 states either funded official state churches with tax dollars, or they literally forced politicians to profess a specific faith to maintain social order. Disestablishment, the process of unwinding all that, was a slow, agonizing unraveling.
Separating religion from government wasn't instantaneous at all. It was a messy, state-by-state slog that took almost 60 years. South Carolina tried to compromise in 1778, letting churches incorporate for tax reasons, but only if they agreed to basic Christian tenets. It took them until 1790 to drop religious restrictions for public office. And Massachusetts, they didn't end their tax support for the Congregational Church until 1833, decades after the Revolution.
Now, I know what you're probably thinking. What about the First Amendment in 1791? Well, there's a huge misconception here. Early on, that constitutional guarantee of religious liberty only applied federally. The Bill of Rights stopped the federal government from establishing a religion, sure, but it did absolutely nothing to stop individual states from enforcing their own religious requirements or funding their own churches with public money. The states were completely left to their own devices.
Section 5. The Spiritual Marketplace. Because as that state-level government support finally faded, things got highly competitive.
This open spiritual marketplace caused some wild shifts in American faith. New denominations were popping up everywhere, but nobody played the open market quite like the Methodists. They broke from the Church of England in 1784 to form their own uniquely American group, and their growth was explosive. They went from under 1,000 members to capturing a staggering 34%, more than a third, of all American churchgoers by the mid-19th century. How did they do it? Pure logistical genius. Instead of waiting around to build permanent brick-and-mortar churches, they sent out traveling itinerant preachers known as circuit riders. These folks, men and occasionally women, literally brought religion directly to the people. They rode west right alongside the expanding frontier, crossing the Alleghenies into the Ohio River Valley, tracking down new settlers who were desperate to have their spiritual needs met.
This whole transformation, uncoupling the church from the state and the massive surge in personal choice, was heavily championed by leaders like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Jefferson viewed state-mandated religion as a tool of oppression. He pushed for disestablishment so that religion could be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. To him, it was a fundamental, natural liberty, not something a government should ever mandate.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, think about the incredible contradictions we've just looked at. You have this young nation boldly expanding spiritual freedoms and embracing this wild, open religious market. But at the exact same time, it's heavily entrenching racial exclusion, severely narrowing the definition of citizenship, and aggressively expanding the slave economy across the South. How do you think those foundational paradoxes collided in the decades that followed? Because the way America defined freedom in these early years absolutely set the stage for the massive conflicts of the coming century. Thanks for joining me today, and keep exploring these incredible turning points in history.